Hello, and welcome to hashtag Here to Here Keeping It 100 podcast. My name is Damon Naylor, and I will be serving as your host. I am the media guru for NAFCM. I am joined by my co-host, DG Mon, the president of NAFCM. What's going on, DG?
Hey, Damon, how are you? I am so excited to meet the author of John Lewis, A Life, and get this conversation going.
Right. Likewise. Well, today, guys, we have a brilliant guest with us, none other than David Greenberg out of Manhattan, New York, or New York City, as he told us. David is a professor of history and journalism and media studies at Rutgers University and a frequent commentator on historical and political affairs and the author of John Lewis, A Life. So, without further ado, we're going to bring David in and have this awesome conversation with him. Welcome, David. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be with you.
Of course, we are so happy to have you, and we're looking forward to this interview. We've been looking forward to it, and I've just let the audience know a little bit about your background, but I'm going to pitch it to you and allow you to tell them anything else you would like them to know.
I've just finished this biography of John Lewis that I started about 5 years ago. I've written several books before this, books of history and politics, but really this one was a labor of love and a privilege to write. And, it was one of, usually, writers will tell you it's hard writing books, it's a struggle. And of course, there were challenges in writing this one, but it was also something I woke up every day kind of eager to get to. And that was just a great feeling. So I'm excited. So excited it's coming out now and have the chance to share it with people.
Wonderful. Well, with you being an author of several books, one of the first questions I have is what inspired you to become so interested in John Lewis's life and then eventually pen your biography about him?
Yeah, well, he was someone as a political junkie. I worked as a political journalist for a number of years in Washington and then became a political historian. And so, I was obviously very aware of John Lewis, who he was, and more generally, kind of grew up in a household where the achievements of the civil rights movement were very important and respected. My parents were of a generation for whom that was very important, and lived through that and supported that transformation in America. And I'd written most of my other books on presidents, and at a certain point, I was looking around for a new project. It was in the middle of the Trump years, and a lot of people were suggesting I do a Trump book. And I thought to myself, that's the last thing I want to do right now. I am, spending every day, as it were, already with Trump. Like he was just everywhere in the media. I want to find a book that takes me away from him. And John Lewis just kind of kept popping up in the news. And one day I was watching a documentary about Robert Kennedy. I guess I have to say Robert Kennedy Sr. these days, but the original RFK. And John Lewis comes on the screen talking about his work on the Kennedy campaign of 1968. And I hadn't known or remembered that he'd worked with Bobby Kennedy. And I thought, that's interesting. And then I went and discovered there was no biography of John Lewis. And, I called up my agent. I said, no one's done this. This is a historically important man, and he really needs a first-rate biography. Maybe I can try to be the one.
Well, that's awesome. And we're definitely happy that you've captured such a wonderful life. I guess you would consider it divine, right? It just happened, that you made that connection and he just resonated with you and just kept coming up in your life to want to be able to capture him.
Yeah, and it took me a while to make contact with him, kind of get through the gatekeepers and get a meeting with him. But once I did, I told him I wanted to write this, and he gave me his blessing to do it. His chief of staff, a wonderful guy named Michael Collins, was very supportive, helped open a lot of doors for me. And then even after Mr. Lewis died, which was really just about a year and a half after I first reached out to him, Michael continued to help, and other people in the Lewis family and friends were very cooperative. So although I had complete editorial independence, it's not a so-called authorized biography in that sense. I did have the cooperation of lots of people who worked with him and who knew him well.
So I know a lot of people who study his life that know about his history and politics and just different things of that nature, just the formal things. But what I want to know is, what were some surprising facts that you discovered about Mr. Lewis during your process?
Well, I think so. The one big thing I discovered that was kind of a surprise is just how skilled a politician he was. He really, it's true, of course, that he was a very principled man, and he was known, both in his days in the movement and then later in his years in Congress for being a man of great convictions and of moral authority. But he was also a good politician. He knew when to compromise. He knew when to listen to voters back home if they were telling him something important. He wasn't just, a purist who was going to say, this is my position, I'm sticking to it no matter what. So, all kinds of examples you can find of him cooperating with Republicans and making deals that maybe postponed a goal he wanted to achieve, but helped him achieve it eventually. And so that political sense was really interesting to discover. Then there was like little discoveries. I discovered that he was a phenomenal collector of art, particularly African-American art, and his home and office were full of original works by some of the country's great Black painters like Jacob Lawrence and Romare Bearden. I discovered, personal sides of him, how much he liked to spend his days in Congress just kind of going out in the halls and meeting student groups and telling them stories about the civil rights years and sometimes the frustrations that would cause for his staff. So I think you get a human portrait of him in the book as well that is probably different from, just the John Lewis that you would see on the news.
If I can move from there, the book for me was a fascinating and easy read, I think, because it was so fascinating, especially with the arc from growing up in the rural county in South Alabama, where you describe how for Black students, the buses many times drove on unpaved roads. And so when it rained hard, got stuck in the mud, and I could visually see the kids pushing the buses, to your description near Mr. Lewis's transition when he came to Black Lives Matter Square in the district. And I felt that same emotion in there, that he was pushing the bus through the mud, that he was going to get this to happen. And while I hear you say he compromised, and compromise is good, I got a sense that he didn't compromise his values, the values that held up the beloved community, and his departure from SNCC because he held on to his values, his loss of some friendships that were important to him because he held on to his values, to me, it is so critical in this process and inspiring. So I just want folks to know who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, that it is heartbreaking, it is joyous, it has unexpected turns, and even what I thought I knew added a lot of nuance and texture to the story. What would you say was his North Star, his guiding value as you reflect back on the work that you created?
Yeah, well, I think you're right that he did keep these values, which he never wanted to compromise on. There's a difference between when you're getting legislation through, what can we do this congressional term versus where do we as a country, as a people, eventually have to get. And he considered that, you use the term the beloved community. And it's a term that goes back a ways, but really was brought into the civil rights movement by people like Martin Luther King and James Lawson, and really was an expression of this nonviolent philosophy. So for a lot of people in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and elsewhere in the movement, nonviolence was a tactic. It was a way that you could show the rest of the nation that here we are, peaceful protesters getting beat up by these racist white segregationists, and win their sympathy. But for John Lewis and his teachers like King and Lawson, it was something they felt, to the depths of their soul, and it was a whole philosophy and way of life. And nonviolence meant envisioning a world, which they called the beloved community, in which there would be sort of harmonious relations among all of us, in which violence would not be used to solve problems. And it would be a kind of, it's almost like a religious, vision or a religious ideal. And he held to that. And so when SNCC and others in the movement wanted to turn away from nonviolence, that was the point at which he broke with them. The other piece I think that's really important, it's a word maybe we don't hear as much today, and in some ways it's because we've achieved a good measure of it, is integration. That as much as he did not shy from being a leader of the Black community and of a Black equality movement, he always wanted it to be a place where there was room, an important role for whites or people of all races, people of any gender or sexual orientation or religion. He really was a universalist in that regard. And I think that's something too that he held with him. So he became a great spokesman for his Jewish constituents, for Catholic constituents, for gay and lesbians. And he saw that as of a piece with his fundamental values and orientation.
I want to build on that a bit, because something in the book you talk about is some of the newspapers saying he wasn't Black enough because he wanted that equality for one meant equality for all. He truly appreciated that equality really is about equity and about meeting people where they are. From his conversations with the segregationist Governor Wallace, I think that was his name, to his relationship with Barnard Rustin, that he would not exclude him from meetings when others did because they thought Rustin being a gay man would be something that would hurt the movement. I found even to his death, so I don't know if you know who planned his funeral, that you write that they stopped at both a synagogue to honor the Jewish connections and stopped at, I guess there's a particular intersection in Atlanta that is known as being an LGBTQ plus intersection, and that he specifically wanted his hearse to stop at both on his way to the church. I'm curious because the book doesn't cite who inspired that. Was that something he had written in a codicil, or how did that come about? Do you know?
Yeah, I believe that was based on his instructions. He did sort of shortly before his death turn to Michael Collins, again, who was his longtime chief of staff and one of the people in the world closest to him, and say, okay, here's what I want for my funeral. And Michael's there in the hospital room with him, listening and nodding. And John Lewis pauses and he says, Michael, you're not writing this down. So he did have ideas. He said, Michael joked with me. He said he told me who he wanted at the funeral, and he told me who he didn't want at the funeral. So even the great man of forgiveness had I think maybe one or two people he didn't want there. But so yeah, I believe that Michael, probably got that from Mr. Lewis himself. But when they had, when he died, the commemoration, the whole week of memorials was just greater than anything you'd ever seen for a U.S. congressman. I mean, it was kind of mind-boggling. You know, each city that was an important part of his life, from Troy, Alabama, to Washington, D.C., back to Atlanta, Selma, of course, where he had the sort of famous confrontation with the Alabama state troopers to win voting rights. So all of these cities had their own rituals, and they got a whole group together to sort of plan this. How are we going to manage all the press? How are we going to manage, doing programs for each event? Who will speak? And a volunteer group of friends, staffers, allies, put together this sort of marvelous celebration of his life that, many people saw on TV during that week in 2020.
I could feel it, and I wish his voice was still here, and I feel like I hear it in this book. I just came back from Alabama on a civil rights tour, and the person was wonderful and eloquent, but when it came to Mr. Lewis's connections with the Jewish community, when it came to Mr. Lewis's relationship with the LGBT community, both were put in the closet, down to a reference of people all bringing their wives to a particular celebration, and Mr. Rustin did not bring his. It's because Mr. Rustin would not have one. So I think I sit with that when I hear you say, I think we're really on our way to this integration. I'm not sure that we are, and I think we need to keep moving. And that's why our members exist, because we exist to help communities wherever there's a disagreement, disruption, or disturbance, lean in and say, how do we together see each other, really see each other, really create what it means, what justice means, what peace means, what being engaged with each other means, and then how are we going to proceed together? And I found that that's how he lived his life. It's messy, it's not clean, it's not simple. There are compromises along the way, as long as you don't compromise your values, and knowing what a cornerstone he is for our particular work and our members' particular work. What do you think, based on your work, Mr. Lewis would encourage us to do now to continue to enhance this beloved community he envisioned?
Yeah, I mean, it does certainly feel in America these days, we're in danger of sliding back. And whether it was with the rise of Newt Gingrich in the 90s or the rise of Donald Trump in the last few years of John Lewis's life, he was very, very alert to that, the ways in which the achievements of the civil rights movement had to be protected and preserved, and then continued, as you say, the fight continued. He would say, I think, first of all, very relevant in this season, vote. He actually kind of came a bit late to the cause of voting rights. Initially, when he was doing those sit-ins at the lunch counters in Nashville and other forms of desegregation action, he thought the campaign to push for voting rights was kind of a distraction that the Kennedy administration was offering to keep them away from these more confrontational tactics. But soon enough, he came around to see its importance. And of course, at Selma, where he marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and was beaten so badly, that helped mobilize the country behind a voting rights bill. And thereafter, it became sort of his cause. And so he would always say, vote like you've never voted before. I don't quite know what that means. There's kind of only one way to get to a poll and cast your X, on the ballot. But he meant, I guess, with a certain fervor and determination, make sure you get there, make sure your friends and family get there. And then he also was a believer in continued forms of protest. Bayard Rustin had a famous article called From Protest to Politics, where he encouraged members of the movement to channel their energies into politics. And Lewis, who really was kind of a protege of Rustin as well as of King, took him up on that. But Lewis never dropped the tools of protest. So, I write about how when they're trying to do something about gun violence, David Cicilline, a congressman from Rhode Island, had an idea where a bunch of them would come up to the well of the Congress and then just refuse to leave the well until Congress took up a gun bill. And then John Lewis said to Cicilline, and then we could sit down. And that suggestion just brought together the power of the 1960 sit-ins with the new power of the gun control movement. So he continued to bring protest into even what he did as a congressman. So I think he would say both are necessary. Politics is necessary and protest is also necessary.
And I think before I turn it over back to Damon here, in that beloved community, I think he was also party blind. From what I read here, it's the values you share. So it didn't matter what your party affiliation was. It didn't matter what your religious affiliation was. What mattered is, do you see the dignity in each person you encounter, and do you celebrate that dignity? And so I just wanted to underscore that as well. In our process, as many of our members represent the spectrum of faith and party and everything else you can think of, yet we are shared by this desire to help mobilize our community so we can together co-create that beloved community Mr. Lewis saw. So
yeah. Well, if I could just, on that point, say quickly, it maybe seemed like a contradiction, but I don't think it was. He could be partisan at times. He was in the Democratic House leadership, but he always worked with Republicans, and he always said every major civil rights bill was passed with bipartisan support. That was through the '64 bill and subsequent bills. And, even his sort of big legislative achievement, which was the creation of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, he finally achieved through a partnership with Sam Brownback, a very conservative religious, senator from Kansas. And they developed a really beautiful relationship in getting that legislation passed. So yeah, he didn't let skin color, influence his judgment of who you were, and he didn't let party or religion or other things either.
Well, this has been a magnificent conversation, very thought-provoking and intriguing. And before we close, we just want to ask you one last question, which is, what do you want readers to come away with after reading this book?
Well, it's a fair question. I think most of all, I want them to feel like I've done justice to the life of John Lewis, that I've given a sort of rich and full and well-rounded portrait of him. And I imagine people will draw from his life, different things. For some people, it may be lessons and like a direct political message about activism. For others, it might be, an interest in his very distinctive psychology and the compassion and forgiveness that he was able to muster for, former rivals, former enemies even. People, I think, will find many different facets of his life to be inspiring, provocative, but I want them to feel like, I've done justice to the very, complicated but also historically important life of a man we were lucky to have among us.
Right. Awesome. Well, I tell you, this has been great, and we stand in agreement with you, believing and hoping that your book really touches lives and does amazing. So we just thank you for gracing us with your presence and being with us and giving such a wonderful interview, David. So we appreciate you. And like I said, once again, we thank you for being such a tremendous guest on our show.
Great. Well, thank you both. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you. And I appreciate the interest in the book, and I hope your members, your listeners will appreciate it too.
Yes, sir. DG, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
No, other than it was an honor to meet you. There's very few books that have seeped into my dreams, and this one did after reading certain parts.
Yes, like I said, we feel privileged to have such an amazing author on the show with us there.
Good. Well, I'm glad to do it. And yeah, I thank you for having me on.
Yes, yes. Well, we thank everyone for tuning in to hashtag Here to Here Keeping It 100 podcast. And surely David has kept it 100 with us today. We thank you guys for tuning in, and we ask that you just continue to tune in for each show. Thank you and take care.